Whispers echo through the mountains, whispers of men who vanished into the wilderness. Their cabins stand silent, like tombstones of forgotten lives. Who were they, and what secrets did they leave behind in the wood they carved? August 23rd, 1823. The Rocky Mountain wilderness stretches endlessly before a grizzly bay's claws. Hugh Glass lies bleeding, his ribs shattered, flesh torn open to the bone. His companions, young Jim Bridger among them, wait for him to die. They take his rifle, his knife, his hope. They leave him for dead. But Hugh Glass doesn't die. What happened next will become legend. But tonight, we're not just telling you about Hugh Glass. We're revealing something far more extraordinary. These mountain men didn't just survive the wilderness. They conquered it with nothing but their bare hands and an axe. They built homes that could withstand blizzards that killed wolves. They created sanctuaries in places where death lurked behind every tree. Richard Proeneke disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness in 1968 at age 51. For 30 years, no rescue teams, no supply drops, no backup plans. Just him, his tools, and a determination that defied everything we think we know about human limits. The cabin he built by hand near Twin Lakes still stands today, a monument to what one man could achieve when civilization became his enemy. But here's what nobody tells you about these mountain men. They weren't just survivors. They were master engineers, architects of the impossible, men who could read the forest like a blueprint and turn raw timber into fortresses that outlasted empires. Jim Bridger could navigate 2 million square miles of unmapped wilderness using nothing but the map he carried in his mind. He knew where every river bent, where every mountain peaked, where danger waited and where safety could be carved from chaos. Tonight, you're going to discover how they did it. How a man with nothing but an axe could transform a hostile wilderness into home. How they selected trees that would stand for centuries. How they carved joints so perfect they needed no nails, no glue, nothing but the precision of desperate men who knew that one mistake meant death. You'll learn the forgotten techniques that could build a cabin in temperatures that freeze steel. The ancient knowledge that turned logs into walls stronger than brick. The secret methods that kept these structures standing long after their builders became dust. But first, if you're ready to uncover the lost arts that conquered the American frontier, hit that like button right now. Subscribe and ring the notification bell because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about human capability. And drop a comment below. Have you ever built something with your own hands that surprised even you? Because what these mountain men accomplished, it wasn't just construction, it was resurrection. They took the dead forest and breathed life into shelter that became legend. The year was 1823, and America's bravest men were about to prove that with the right knowledge, the right techniques, and the right desperation, even the wilderness could be tamed. Who were these men really? John Colter first answered the call of the West in 1804, when he took off on a journey to the Pacific Ocean, and back as part of Lewis and Clark's famed Corps of Discovery. But when Lewis and Clark headed home, Colter made a choice that defied all logic. He turned his back on civilization and walked into the wilderness alone. Why would a man leave everything behind to face storms, hunger, and solitude? The answer isn't what you think. The fur trading lifestyle was often a solitary one. It attracted particular types of men, especially loners and skilled woodsmen. Contrary to stereotypes, many were highly educated, though some came from the lowest rungs of society. These weren't just rough frontiersmen. They were Harvard graduates running from debt, professors fleeing scandal, veterans haunted by battles they couldn't forget. Were they seeking freedom or running from something? John Colter encountered several hundred blackfeet who demanded they come ashore. Colter went ashore and was disarmed and stripped naked. When his partner Ports refused to come ashore, he was shot and wounded. Ports then shot one of the Indian warriors and was made a riddle of arrows. Picture this. You're standing naked in front of 300 warriors. Your partner's blood is pooling at your feet. The chief points into the wilderness and speaks words you don't understand, but you know what they mean. Run. The chief set Colter loose with Indians running after him. For 10 kilometers, Colter ran naked through cactus fields with more than 100 Blackfoot on his tail. He was such a swift runner that he eventually outdistanced them all, except for one spear-wielding man. 100 warriors, 10 kilometers of thorns shredding his flesh. One spear, one chance. Naked, battered, and hundreds of miles from safety. he swam downstream, beginning an arduous 7-day trek to Fort Raymond. Surviving on roots and sheer determination, he arrived sunburned and starving, but alive. 7 days, no clothes, no food, no weapons, no hope, except the knowledge that somewhere ahead, civilization waited. But here's what haunts historians. Why did Coulter go back? 3 weeks after nearly dying, after losing everything, after proving that one man could outrun death itself. John Coulter packed his gear and headed straight back into Blackfoot territory, back to the same mountains that had tried to kill him, back to build another cabin in the same wilderness that had stripped him of everything. This wasn't survival anymore. This was something else entirely. Jim Bridger was only 18 years old when he joined with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company in 1822. His first trapping expedition was along the Missouri River and would mark the beginning of a 4 to 5 year career. 18 years old. Most teenagers today can't build a bookshelf from IKEA instructions. Jim Bridger was constructing shelters that would outlast 3 generations. What drove these men to abandon comfort, safety, family, everything that made life worth living, to create homes in places where home had never existed? The mountain men weren't just building cabins. They were performing acts of defiance against nature itself. Every notch they carved, every log they lifted, every joint they fitted was a declaration that humanity could triumph over the wild. But there's something else. Something the history books don't tell you. These men knew secrets. Techniques passed down through whispered conversations around dying fires. Methods that turned simple trees into architectural marvels without a single nail, screw, or modern tool. They could read the forest like a master craftsman reads with grain, knowing exactly which tree would hold weight, which angle would shed rain, which joint would expand and contract with the seasons without breaking. They built homes that breathed with the mountain air, structures that could bend without breaking, walls that could stop a grizzly's charge, foundations that would support a roof heavy with 10 feet of snow. And they did it all while knowing that any mistake, any miscalculation, any moment of weakness could mean death. The question isn't how they built these cabins. The question is why they risked everything to build them in the first place. What were they really constructing out there in the wilderness? Shelter, or something far more powerful. Because when you study their methods, when you understand their techniques, when you see what they accomplished with nothing but an axe and raw determination, you realize they weren't just surviving the frontier. They were conquering it, one perfectly fitted log at a time. They came from different worlds, but they all shared the same hunger. The Carrés de Bois, French-Canadian fur traders who operated without licenses, trading illegally beyond Montreal's reach. These men weren't just breaking trade laws, they were breaking free from civilization itself. The French king had forbidden his subject from trading west of Montreal by 1696, but the forest swarmed with these illegal traders anyway. What drove them to risk everything for the unknown? George Drouillard, born to a French-Canadian father and a Shawnee mother in Detroit, became one of Lewis and Clark's most valued members. He could read tracts like other men read newspapers. He could speak in sign language to tribes who had never seen a white man. He could disappear into wilderness that swallowed lesser men whole and emerge weeks later with enough furs to buy a small fortune. But Drouillard never bought that fortune. Instead, he walked deeper into the mountains, further from everything he'd ever known. Why? American frontiersmen followed different paths to the same destination. Veterans of frontier wars who couldn't adjust a peace. Farmers whose crops had failed 3 seasons running. Debtors fleeing creditors. Men carrying secrets too heavy for civilized society to bear. They weren't just leaving home. They were abandoning the very concept of home. Kit Carson explored the west of California and north through the Rocky Mountains, living among and marrying into the Arapaho and Cheyenne tribes. He didn't visit these tribes. He became one of them. These men weren't tourists in the wilderness. They were refugees seeking something that existed nowhere else on Earth. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Jacques La Ramey arrived in Wyoming in 1815, a respected French-Canadian trapper who had earned the trust of every tribe he'd encountered. 5 years later, he set off for his usual trapping season along the river that now bears his name. He never returned. No body, no witnesses, no trace. Stories of his death contradict each other wildly. Some say he slipped on ice and fell into the river. Others claim his body was found in a small cabin. The most disturbing account? That he was found stuffed under a beaver dam. When search parties went looking for him, the Arapaho strongly denied any involvement in his disappearance. The same people who had trusted him, traded with him, welcomed him into their territory. They seemed genuinely puzzled by his vanishing. So what happened to Jacques Ramey? This wasn't an isolated incident. The wilderness was collecting men, and not all of them were falling victim to bears or starvation or exposure. Some were simply vanishing. Experienced mountain men who knew every trail, every danger, every way to survive, gone without explanation. Did the wilderness claim them, or did they find a hidden paradise only they knew? Because it is what haunts every researcher who studies these disappearances. These men didn't just vanish randomly. They vanished at the peak of their skills, at the height of their knowledge, when they knew the mountains better than anyone alive. Ramey had been trapping successfully for 5 years in the same region. He knew where the dangers lay. He knew which routes were safe, which camps offered shelter, which rivers could be trusted. Men like him didn't make amateur mistakes. So when experienced mountain men started disappearing, other trappers began whispering about something else entirely. About hidden valleys where the hunting never ended. About secret camps where men could live like kings of their own private empires. About places so perfect, so abundant, that men would kill to keep them secret. The French called them coureurs de bois, runners of the woods. But they weren't running toward something. They were running away. Away from debt, from war, from laws, from expectations, from the crushing weight of civilized life pressing down on their shoulders like a mountain itself. These weren't adventurers seeking glory. They were men seeking escape. And the wilderness offered them something no city ever could, the chance to disappear completely and reinvent themselves as something new. But reinvention required survival. And survival in the Rocky Mountains meant one thing above all else: shelter. The mountain men who survived weren't just lucky. They were builders, architects of the impossible. Men who could look at a stand of trees and see walls, floors, roofs. Men who could transform raw timber into fortress homes using nothing but the knowledge they carried in their heads and the tools they carried on their backs. The question isn't why they left civilization. The question is how they created something better than civilization in places where civilization had never existed. And the answer lies in the techniques they used to build not just cabins, but entire new lives from scratch. The first strike of steel against wood changes everything. Picture this moment. Dawn breaks over the mountains. Mist rises from valleys that have never known human footsteps, and somewhere in this vast silence, a man raises his axe. The weight of survival rests in his hands. One swing, one choice. Life or death carved into every decision he's about to make. But before that axe ever touches bark, before the first tree falls, before the first log takes shape, there's something else happening. Something that separates the mountain men who built legendary cabins from those whose bones bleached white in forgotten clearings. The selection process. Mountain men didn't just choose trees. They chose destiny. Walk through any forest today and you'll see hundreds of potential building materials. But the mountain man's trained eye saw something different entirely. He saw structural integrity hidden beneath bark, moisture content that would determine whether his walls would crack or hold, grain patterns that would predict how each log would settle over decades of mountain weather. A lodgepole pine grows straight and tall, reaching towards sunlight with desperate hunger. Perfect for cabin walls, you might think, but the mountain man knew better. Lodgepoles crack under pressure. They split when temperatures plummet. They become kindling when they should become foundation. Instead, he searched for the outcasts, the trees that had struggled, the gnarled specimens that had weathered decades of storms, that were compressed into something harder than iron by years of mountain punishment. These trees had already proven they could survive anything the wilderness could deliver. But here's where the mystery deepens. Archaeological surveys of abandoned mountain man camps reveal something extraordinary. Different construction styles scattered across the same regions. Some cabins show perfect saddle notches, carved with surgical precision. Others display dovetail joints that rival furniture craftsmanship. Still others use techniques that don't match any known building tradition from Europe or America. Did men teach each other these methods, or were some built by hands long vanished? Because when experts examine these construction variations, they discover something that defies explanation. The advanced techniques often appear in the most remote locations, the places where no mountain man should have possessed such sophisticated knowledge. places where survival alone would consume every waking moment, leaving no time for perfecting complex joinery methods. Yet there they stand, architectural puzzles carved into reality by men who supposedly learned everything through trial and error. Let me tell you about the axe that started it all. When evening descended on mountain camps, when the day's hunting was done and the fires burned low, the mountain men performed a ritual that separated the living from the dead. They sharpened their axes, not just maintained them, perfected them, because tomorrow their life would depend on every angle, every edge, every carefully honed surface of that steel blade. The process began with selecting the perfect stone. River rocks worn smooth by centuries of current, sandstone formations that provided just the right grit. But the true masters carried something else, whetstones they'd acquired through trade with tribes who guarded their quarrying locations like state secrets. By firelight, they'd work the steel, long, measured strokes that created edges so sharp they could shave hair, so true they could split with fibers like silk threads. The sound of steel against stone became the wilderness lullaby, a rhythmic promise that tomorrow would bring progress, not defeat. But sharpening wasn't just about creating a tool. It was about creating precision in a world where precision meant survival. Watch a modern logger take down a tree and you'll see power tools, safety equipment, calculated measurements. The mountain man possessed none of these advantages. His weapon against 100-foot giants was a single-bit axe weighing maybe 4 pounds, a handle crafted from hickory or ash, and knowledge that had been owned through pain. The first cut determines everything. Too high, and the tree falls wrong. Too low, and you're fighting gravity itself. The mountain man studied each tree like a surgeon studies anatomy. He traced the lean, calculated the weight distribution, predicted exactly where that massive trunk would crash to earth. Then came the moment of truth. The first swing sent echoes rolling through valleys that had known only silence. Every mountain creature within miles heard that sound, the percussion of human ambition striking against natural dominion. But who else might have heard it? Other trappers working distant claims? Hunting parties tracking game through timber? Or something far more dangerous, men who preferred their wilderness uninhabited and their secrets undiscovered? Because every echo carried risk. The sound of construction announced presence. It declared intention. It revealed location to anyone or anything capable of following sound through mountain acoustics that could carry a whisper for miles. Yet the mountain men continued. Strike after calculated strike, each blow precisely placed to guide the giants full exactly where physics and experience promised it would land. The moment of timber, that thunderous crash that shook the earth and sent wildlife fleeing for miles, marked the transformation from forest to building material. But felling was only the beginning. Now came the work that would test every muscle, every skill, every ounce of determination these men possessed. Limbing the fallen giant, stripping away branches that had reached towards sunlight for decades, measuring lengths that would become walls, calculating diameters that would determine structural strength. Each mountain man developed his own method for peeling bark. Some used draw knives, pulling long strips that curled away like ancient parchment. Others preferred to score the bark with their axes, creating geometric patterns that allowed easy removal. The bark itself became valuable insulation for chinking gaps between logs, material for emergency shelter, tinder for fires that could mean the difference between life and death. But here's what modern builders never understand about the mountain man's approach to log preparation. They weren't just removing bark. They were performing surgery on living wood. Each cut, each peel, each careful stroke revealed the tree's internal structure. Knots that would weaken joints, grain patterns that would expand and contract with seasonal changes, hidden rut that could compromise an entire wall. The mountain man learned to read wood like prophecy. A slight discoloration here meant moisture damage. An unusual growth pattern there indicated stress point that would fail under load. This knowledge couldn't be taught from books or learned in workshops. It came from handling thousands of logs, from making mistakes that could kill you, from developing an intuitive understanding of organic architecture that modern engineers still struggle to replicate. Then came the notching, and this is where the real mystery begins. The saddle notch represents the most traditional joining method, a curved depression carved into the underside of each log, allowing it to rest securely on the log below. Simple in concept, devastating in execution, because every notch must match perfectly. Too shallow, and the logs don't seat properly, creating gaps that invite wind, rain, and cold. Too deep, and you weaken the structural integrity of your entire wall. The mountain man possessed no measuring tools beyond his own eye and experience. No levels, no squares, no guides. He carved each notch by sight and feel, trusting decades of accumulated knowledge to guide his hands. Yet archaeological analysis reveals notch precision that rivals modern machinery. But then there's the dovetail notch. And this is where everything we think we know about mountain men breaks down completely. Dovetail joints require mathematical precision. They demand understanding of compound angles, weight distribution, compression forces, and geometric relationships that most carpenters study for years to master. Yet mountain men were creating dovetail log joints in remote wilderness locations where they supposedly had no access to advanced training, no master craftsmen to learn from, no tradition of sophisticated joinery work. The dovetail notch uses trapezoidal shapes cut into logs to create interlocking connections that actually grow stronger under pressure. When done correctly, the joint becomes mechanically impossible to separate without complete deconstruction. It's cabinet-making artistry applied to massive timber construction. So how did illiterate trappers master techniques that challenge modern craftsmen? The answer lies in something historians rarely discuss. These men weren't working alone. They were part of a shadow network of knowledge that spanned the entire frontier. Information passed through coded conversations around trading post fires. Techniques demonstrated in remote camps where sworn secrecy protected methods from becoming common knowledge. Skills inherited from mysterious mentors who appeared in the wilderness, taught their craft, then vanished back into legends. Because when researchers mapped the distribution of advanced notching techniques across the frontier, they discover patterns that defy random learning. Sophisticated methods appear simultaneously in locations separated by hundreds of miles of impassable terrain. Identical joint styles show up in cabins built by men who supposedly never met, never communicated, never shared their knowledge. Unless they did. Unless the mountain men operated according to rules we've never understood. Unless their cabin building techniques were part of something larger, more organized, more purposeful than random individuals struggling to survive in the wilderness. The evidence is carved into every perfectly fitted joint, hidden in every impossibly precise angle, whispered through every technique that shouldn't exist but does. And tomorrow, when we reveal the construction methods that created these architectural impossibilities, you'll understand why some secrets were worth dying to protect and why others were worth killing to keep. 1,000 pounds of raw timber suspended above your head. No ropes, no pulleys, no safety nets. Just you, your exhausted muscles, and gravity waiting to crush your dreams into dust. This is the moment that separated the living from the dead in mountain man construction, the wall-raising phase, where mathematical precision met brute force, where one miscalculation could end everything you'd worked months to achieve, where men discovered the true way to their ambitions. Literally, the mountain men didn't just build cabins. They performed death-defying acts of engineering with tools that belonged in museums and knowledge that existed nowhere in textbooks. They lifted logs that would challenge modern machinery using nothing but leverage, determination, and techniques that have been lost to time. If you're captivated by these forgotten methods and want to discover how ordinary men accomplish the impossible, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what you're about to learn will redefine everything you thought you knew about human capability. And tell me in the comments, what's the heaviest thing you've ever lifted by yourself? Because these men were moving half tons of timber alone in the wilderness. Let me show you how they did it, and why some of them never lived to see their walls completed. The first log sets the foundation for everything that follows. But raising that second course, that's where men discovered whether they possessed the strength to match their dreams. Each subsequent log grows heavier as walls climb higher. Physics becomes the enemy. Gravity transforms from inconvenience to executioner. Many men worked alone. Imagine balancing a half-ton log with no one there to help if it fell. Picture James Clyman, veteran of the Black Hawk War, standing beneath a freshly cut pine log that measures 2 feet in diameter and stretches 20 feet long. The mathematics of failure dance through his mind. One slip, one moment of weakness, one slight miscalculation, and that timber becomes a weapon capable of crushing bones to powder. But Clyman had discovered something that modern construction workers with their safety harnesses and hydraulic equipment never learn. The human body, when pushed beyond its perceived limits, when driven by the absolute necessity of survival, becomes capable of extraordinary feats. not through superhuman strength, but through superhuman efficiency. The mountain men developed lifting techniques that modern engineers study but cannot fully replicate. They understood leverage points that transform crushing weight into manageable resistance. They created fulcrum systems using fallen logs, rocks, and carefully positioned supports that multiplied their strength exponentially. But more than that, they understood the psychological warfare construction. Working alone in the wilderness meant confronting not just physical challenges, but mental demons that civilization had never prepared them for. The crushing weight of isolation, the maddening repetition of identical tasks performed day after day, the constant awareness that one accident, one injury, one moment of lost concentration could transform shelter construction into grave preparation. The cold wind, cold weather, cold water, cold snow, cold. That was how one mountain man described his reality in journal entries that revealed the psychological toll of frontier construction. But cold was just one enemy. Exhaustion fought against progress every day. Muscles screamed protest after hours of lifting, positioning, and securing massive timbers. Hands blistered and bled from handling rough bark and splintered wood. Backs ached from maintaining positions that human spines were never designed to sustain. Yet they continued, because stopping meant dying. Listen to this journal entry, written by firelight after a day of wall construction. My arms shake like autumn leaves when I try to hold my cup. The logs seem to grow heavier with each placement, as if the mountain itself resists my presence here. But I see progress in the growing walls, and progress is the only medicine for despair. The writer of those words, we don't know. The journal was found decades later in an abandoned camp, its pages brittle with age and exposure. But his words capture something essential about the mountain man experience. They weren't just building structures. They were building hope, one impossibly heavy log at a time. But here's where the construction process reveals its deepest secrets. Binding logs with wooden pegs required knowledge that transcended basic carpentry. The mountain man had to understand what expansion and contraction rates across different species. He needed to predict how wet logs would behave as they dried in their final positions. He had to calculate stress points that would determine whether his walls would settle into permanence or collapse into catastrophe. The pegs themselves tell stories that historians are still deciphering. Made from hardwoods like oak or hickory, shaped with precision that required hours of careful carving, driven into holes that had to be positioned with perfect accuracy. Too tight, and the expanding peg would split the log. Too loose, and the joints would fail when winter storms tested every connection. Each peg was carved by hand, shaped to match the specific requirements of its individual placement. No two were identical because no two positions demanded identical solutions. The mountain man became a custom manufacturer of building components, creating unique solutions for unique challenges using nothing but his knife, his experience, and his absolute determination to succeed. But success came at a price that few modern builders could comprehend. The journals reveal something that sanitized history books never discuss: hallucinations. Men working alone for months at a time, living on minimal food, pushing their bodies beyond endurance limits, began seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that spoke no words, sensing presences that left no tracks. One journal entry describes conversations with a helper who assisted with log placement during particularly difficult construction phases. The writer describes his helper's strength, his knowledge of advanced techniques, his ability to appear exactly when assistance was most desperately needed. But archaeological evidence shows the cabin was built by one man working entirely alone. Was this exhaustion-induced hallucination, or something else entirely? Because the cabin that journal describes still stands today, and its construction quality exceeds anything one man should have been capable of achieving. The joints fit with furniture-maker precision. The walls rise perfectly plumb despite being built without modern leveling tools. The load distribution shows engineering knowledge that would challenge contemporary architects. So either the mountain man achieved impossible levels of construction skill while suffering from isolation-induced hallucinations, or his helper was real. And that's when we encounter the mystery that has haunted frontier researchers for generations. One cabin was found with logs perfectly stacked but no roof. Why did its builder abandon it? The structure was discovered in 1967 by a geological survey team working in remote Colorado wilderness. The walls rose 22 courses high, each log fitted with precision that spoke of master craftsmanship. The dovetail notches showed European influence, but with modifications that improved upon traditional techniques. The foundation stones were positioned with mathematical accuracy, but there was no roof. No evidence that roof construction had ever begun. No tools left behind. No personal belongings. No signs of struggle or accident or disaster. Just perfectly constructed walls rising toward sky they would never shelter. The survey team found something else. Footprints leading away from a cabin, preserved in clay soil that had hardened like concrete. But these weren't the desperate tracks of a man fleeing danger. They were measured, deliberate, purposeful steps. The stride of someone walking toward a destination, not away from catastrophe. Soil analysis revealed those footprints were at least 50 years old when discovered, which meant someone had spent months or possibly years creating architectural perfection, then simply walk away from it. The logical explanations don't satisfy. Illness would have left evidence. Accident would have left a body. Attack would have left signs of struggle. Weather disasters would have damaged the existing construction. Instead, the evidence suggests something far more intriguing. That the builder completed his work exactly as planned, and that plan never included a roof. But why would a man build perfect walls around emptiness? What purpose could four walls serve without the shelter they were designed to provide? What was he really constructing in that remote wilderness location that no one would discover for half a century? The answer lies in understanding that mountain men weren't just building homes. They were building something far more complex, far more purposeful, far more mysterious than simple shelter. They were building monuments to human defiance, proof that individual determination could triumph over impossible odds, evidence that men with axes and knowledge could create permanence in places where permanence had never existed. But some of them were building something else entirely, something that required perfect walls but no roof, something that needed architectural precision but not weather protection, something that transforms our understanding of why these men really vanished into the wilderness. And when you discover what that something was, you'll understand why some cabins were meant to remain incomplete, why some walls were designed to stand open to the sky, why some mountain men built their masterpieces knowing they would never live inside them. Because the greatest mystery isn't how they raised those walls. The mystery is what they intended to do with the space inside them. They built the perfect trap and walked inside willingly. A sealed cabin in the mountains becomes a chamber of death faster than most men realize. The very techniques that protected against blizzards could transform shelter into suffocation. The same walls that kept out wolves, and weather could trap smoke that turned refuge into tomb. One by one, mountain men were found in their own creations, as if they had simply lain down by the fire and never rose again. The roof above wasn't just shelter. It was a difference between life and an agonizing death that came disguised as warmth. But before we reveal why some cabins became death traps while others sustained life for decades, let me share something that will change how you understand mountain construction forever. These weren't amateur builders learning through trial and error. They were masters of atmospheric engineering who understood principles that modern architects struggle with today. The roofing process began with understanding that shelter and death live separated by inches of precision. Birch bark became the foundation of mountain roofing because it was strong, water-resistant, and soil-resistant enough to last for generations, although 30 years was considered the normal lifespan in most wilderness conditions. But harvesting birch bark required knowledge that went far beyond simply stripping material from trees. The mountain man had to understand when bark would peel cleanly, how to preserve its natural oils, and most critically, how to lay it so that water would flow away from his shelter instead of pooling above his head. The process demanded perfect timing. Spring birch bark peeled like paper when the sap rose. Summer bark became stubborn, clinging to wood with adhesive strength. Fall bark cracked and split. Winter bark couldn't be harvested at all. The mountain man possessed maybe 6 weeks each year when nature cooperated with his roofing plans. He would score the bark in K-fold rectangles, each piece calculated to overlap with mathematical precision. Too much overlap wasted precious material. Too little created gaps where water could penetrate and destroy everything below. He worked methodically up the trunk, harvesting sheets that could span several feet without breaks or weak points. But birch bark alone couldn't stop mountain weather. The real protection came from understanding how to create layered defense systems using materials the forest provided free of charge. Moss became the secret weapon of cabin waterproofing. Not just any moss, specific varieties that absorbed moisture without rotting, that expanded when wet to seal gaps, that created insulation barriers without trapping dangerous gases. The mountain man learned to identify sphagnum moss, which could absorb 20 times its own weight in water while maintaining structural integrity. He gathered hair-cap moss, which formed dense mats that shed rain like natural shingles. But gathering moss meant venturing into swamplands where bays congregated, where quicksand waited beneath innocent-looking surfaces, where one wrong step could mean disappearing into bog mud that would preserve your bones for archaeologists to discover centuries later. The mountain men gathered moss anyway, because they understood something that modern builders with their synthetic materials and factory-produced insulation never grasped. Natural materials don't just protect, they breathe. They regulate moisture, temperature, and airflow in ways that keep shelters livable instead of merely weatherproof. Pine sap served as a wilderness equivalent of modern sealants, but harvesting it required techniques that bordered on alchemy. The mountain man learned to wound pine trees in specific patterns that encouraged maximum sap flow without killing the tree. He discovered timing cycles that determined when sap would be thick enough to seal gaps but fluid enough to apply smoothly. He mastered heat treatment methods that transformed raw sap into waterproof compounds stronger than anything available in civilization. But pine sap collection carried its own dangers. Fresh wounds in trees attracted bears who craved the sweet resin. Working around sap-bleeding trees meant dealing with sticky substances that could trap hand to tools, tools to trees, or men to surfaces where they became easy prey for anything hunting the forest. The mountain man collected sap anyway, because he knew that every gap between logs represented a breach in his defense against elements that kill without mercy. He sealed his cabin like a ship preparing for storms, understanding that mountain weather could deliver hurricane-force winds, temperature drops that froze exposed flesh in minutes, and precipitation that could accumulate into crushing loads that collapsed roofs and buried entire structures. Now comes the terrifying part. Creating perfect seals meant controlling airflow with deadly precision. Too much ventilation, and winter cold penetrated every corner, making the cabin uninhabitable when temperatures dropped below survival thresholds. Too little ventilation, and smoke from cooking fires and heating flames had nowhere to escape. Carbon monoxide has no smell, no taste, no warning. It kills silently, peacefully, leaving victims looking as if they simply fell asleep by warm fires and never woke up. Mountain men working alone had no partners to notice symptoms, no backup systems to detect deadly gas accumulations, no emergency protocols to save them when their sealed shelters became gas chambers. The evidence haunts every abandoned cabin researchers discover. Bodies found in sleeping positions near coal fireplaces. No signs of struggle, no indication of violence or accident. Just men who seal their cabins too perfectly and paid the ultimate price for their engineering success. But here's what makes these deaths even more mysterious. Experienced mountain men understood ventilation requirements. They knew the dangers of smoke accumulation. They had witnessed other trappers die from poor air circulation. Yet they continued making the same fatal mistakes, sealing their shelters so completely that they created death traps instead of safe havens. Unless those weren't mistakes at all. Unless some mountain men sealed their cabins knowing exactly what would happen. Unless they chose their fate deliberately, transforming their architectural skills into elaborate suicide methods that would leave their bodies undisturbed until spring thaws brought discovery. Because when you examine the evidence carefully, when you study the precision of these accidental deaths, when you understand the level of knowledge required to create such perfectly lethal sealing systems, you realize these men possess the exact skills needed to prevent these tragedies. They sealed their cabins because they wanted to. But others survived decades in identical conditions, creating ventilation systems so sophisticated they regulated airflow automatically, adjusting to weather conditions without human intervention. These master builders understood something that transformed their shelters from death traps into life-sustaining sanctuaries. They understood the art of controlled breathing, not just for themselves, but for the cabins they inhabited. The successful mountain men created architectural respiratory systems, gaps positioned to create pressure differentials that drew fresh air inside while expelling contaminated air outside. Roof angles that generated updraft powerful enough to pull smoke up and out without allowing cold air to flood downward. Chimney designs that created consistent draw regardless of wind direction or atmospheric pressure. They built cabins that breathed with the rhythm of the mountains themselves. But the greatest mystery wasn't the roofing techniques. It was what happened when mountain men encountered the original inhabitants of these lands during construction phases that left them most vulnerable. Pierre Dorian Jr. was a Métis fur trapper and interpreter who worked across the modern Midwestern United States and later the Pacific Northwest, born to a French father and Yankton Sioux mother. His mixed heritage should have protected him during tribal encounters. His language skills should have enabled peaceful negotiations. His understanding of both cultures should have prevented the conflicts that claimed so many mountain men. But Pierre Dorian Jr. died in 1814 under circumstances that remain unexplained. His wife Marie survived to tell the story, but her account raises more questions than it answers. She described attacks, deaths, escapes, and survival, but something about her narrative doesn't align with physical evidence discovered at sites connected to their story. Because when researchers examine locations where mountain men encountered Native American hunting parties during cabin construction, they find evidence of interactions that defy simple categorization as either peaceful trade or violent conflict. Trading posts built adjacent to mountain cabins, tool marks that suggest collaborative construction techniques, architectural elements that blend European building methods with Native American structural knowledge, evidence of extended cooperation between groups that historical accounts claim were locked in constant warfare. Yet these same sites often show signs of sudden abandonment, half-finished walls, scattered tools, personal belongings left behind as if their owners vanished in the middle of ordinary activities. No bodies, no burial sites, no indication of what caused entire construction projects to halt mid-progress. Sometimes trading, sometimes vanishing conflicts that left no traces except empty cabins and questions that echo through centuries. The mountain men were building more than shelters. They were constructing bridges between worlds that official history claims never connected. They were creating architectural fusion that combined the best survival techniques from multiple cultures. They were proving that cooperation could triumph over conflict when survival demanded innovation. But they were also creating something that threatened established powers, challenged territorial claims, and undermined authority structures that depended on separation rather than collaboration. And when those powers decided that mountain man construction had gone too far, that these architectural experiments represented dangers too great to ignore, some builders discovered that perfect roofs above perfect walls had become perfect tombs for men who knew too much about building something better than the world civilization offered. The question isn't how they sealed their roofs against mountain storms. The question is why some men sealed themselves inside shelters they would never leave alive, and whether they made that choice willingly or had it made for them by forces that preferred their architectural secrets buried with their bones. Fire doesn't just warm a cabin. Fire becomes a cabin's soul, its beating heart, its reason for existence. But fire also kills more mountain men than bays, blizzards, and starvation combined. The difference between life-giving flame and consuming inferno often came down to a single stone placed wrong, one gap left unsealed, one moment of carelessness during construction that would claim its price months later when winter storms trapped men inside their own creations. The hearth wasn't just a centerpiece of mountain survival. It was the most dangerous thing these men would ever build. And they built it knowing that one mistake would burn their dreams to ash. If you're fascinated by how these men mastered the deadly art of fire construction and want to understand why some hearths sustained life for decades while others became crematoriums for their builders, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible survival stories. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever built a fire that you thought might get out of control? Because these men lived with that possibility every single day. Let me show you how they conquered fire and how fire conquered some of them. Stone selection became an art form that could mean the difference between warmth and death. Not all stones can withstand the thermal cycling that mountain hearths demanded. Limestone exploded when heated rapidly. Sandstone crumbled under repeated temperature changes. Granite developed hairline fractures that grew into structural failures over time. The mountain man searched for igneous rocks that had already proven their resistance to heat through geological trials that spanned millennia. Basalt formations provided ideal hearth foundations. Quartzite offered durability that could outlast the cabins built around them. Field stones worn smooth by glacier action show compression strength that could support massive chimney weights. But finding perfect stones meant venturing into territories where other predators hunted. Riverbanks where grizzlies fished for salmon. Rocky outcrops where mountain cats claimed hunting grounds. Quarry sites that tribes considered sacred and defended with methods that left no survivors to describe what happened to trespassers. The mountain man gathered stones anyway, because he understood that compromising on half construction meant compromising on survival itself. Watch the positioning process, and you'll understand why half construction separated masters from amateurs. Every stone had to be placed according to principles that governed heat distribution, structural stability, and fire safety. The foundation stones bore tremendous weight while conducting dangerous temperatures. Cornerstones determined whether rising walls would remain plumb or gradually lean toward collapse. Chimney stones channeled smoke and gases that could kill in minutes if improperly directed. Each placement required understanding physics, chemistry, and engineering simultaneously. The mountain man possessed no formal training in any of these disciplines, yet his survival demanded mastery of all three. The half foundation began with stones so large that moving them challenged human capability. Foundation stones weighing hundreds of pounds had to be positioned with precision that allowed no margin for error. Too high, and the half would tower above comfortable working height. Too low, and ground moisture would seep upward to undermine the entire structure. The exact level determined whether fires would burn efficiently or fill cabins with smoke that transformed shelter into suffocation chambers. But moving foundation stones meant confronting the same deadly mathematics that governed wall construction. Leverage systems using wooden poles as fulcrums. Rolling techniques that required perfect control over massive weights. Positioning methods that demanded strength, timing, and coordination that most modern construction workers couldn't achieve with hydraulic equipment. Many mountain men attempted hard construction alone. No assistance to steady stones during placement. No partners to warn of shifting loads. No backup systems to prevent crushing injuries when stone placement went wrong. They balanced hundreds of pounds of rock while calculating angles, measuring gaps, and maintaining the precise tolerances that would determine whether their heating systems functioned or failed. The mortality rate during half construction exceeded every other phase of cabin building. Men crushed beneath stones they couldn't control. Men trapped under half structures that collapsed during assembly. Men injured so severely during stone placement that they died slowly in cabins that would never warm them. But the survivors created heating systems so sophisticated that modern engineers study the designs for principles that contemporary construction has forgotten. The rising chimney walls required knowledge that transcended basic masonry. Each course of stones had to be positioned to create gradual narrowing that accelerated smoke flow without creating back pressure. The mountain man understood that smoke moved according to pressure differentials, temperature gradients, and A-flow patterns that could be controlled through careful chimney design. He learned to create draft systems that pulled smoke upward regardless of external wind conditions. He mastered damper techniques using flat stones positioned to regulate airflow. He developed baffle systems that prevented downdraft from filling cabins with deadly gases while maintaining consistent heat distribution throughout living spaces. But here's where the mystery deepens into something far more disturbing. The ritual of tending coal became the heartbeat of mountain life. Every few hours, day and night, month after month, the mountain man performed the same life-sustaining ceremony, banking coals to preserve heat through sleeping hours, feeding flames with precisely measured fuel, monitoring combustion to maintain perfect balance between warmth and safety. This ritual demanded constant vigilance. Sleep became fragmented into 2-hour intervals punctuated by coal-tending responsibilities. Relaxation became impossible because fire required attention that never ended. Mental exhaustion accumulated like snow drifts, creating fatigue that impaired judgment and increased the likelihood of fatal mistakes. Yet some mountain men maintained perfect fire for entire winters. Coals that never died, heat that never failed. Combustion systems so perfectly balanced that they operated with clockwork precision through months of isolation and hardship. How did men living alone, without backup systems, without safety nets, without any margin for error, achieve fire management that challenged the skills of trained professionals? The answer appears in journal entries that reveal techniques bordering on supernatural understanding. Listen to this account, written by candlelight in a cabin that archaeologists would later identify as belonging to Jedediah Smith. The coals speak to me now. Their color tells me how long until they die. Their arrangement shows me where to place the next fuel. Their heat teaches me when to open the damper and when to seal the flue. I have become servant to fire, but fire has become servant to my survival. Jedediah Smith understood something about fire management that extended beyond mechanical technique into intuitive mastery. He developed the ability to read combustion like others read books, predicting exactly how flames would behave hours before changes became visible to untrained eyes. But fire was life, and fire was death. The same flames that sustained mountain men through winter nights consumed entire cabins when construction imperfections allowed controlled combustion to become uncontrolled disaster. Hearts cracked under thermal stress, allowing fire to escape into wooden structures that became kindling for infernos that could be seen for miles. Many cabins ended in ash, with no survivors to tell why. The archaeological evidence tells stories that survivors never could. Cabin sites where foundation stones remain perfectly arranged, but everything else has vanished into charcoal and memory. Hearths that show evidence of extreme temperatures far beyond normal heating requirements. Burn patterns that suggest fires burned much hotter and much longer than accidents would produce. These weren't cooking fires that got out of control. These weren't heating fires that escaped containment. These were conflagrations that reached temperatures capable of melting metal, cremating bone, and reducing entire structures to ash so fine that when scattered the remains across valleys that would show no trace of human habitation. But here's what haunts researchers who study these burn sites. The destruction patterns are too perfect, too complete, too thoroughly devastating to resolve from accidents or negligence. They suggest fires that were deliberately designed to eliminate evidence, to erase presence, to remove every trace that construction had ever occurred at these remote locations. Why would mountain men build perfect cabins, then burn them to the ground with methodical thoroughness that left nothing behind except foundation stones and questions? The answer lies in understanding that some mountain men weren't building permanent homes. They were building temporary sanctuaries for activities that required complete secrecy. Activities so sensitive that discovery would mean death. Activities that demanded architectural perfection followed by absolute evidence destruction. They built their masterpieces knowing they would destroy them. They perfected their heating systems knowing they would become cremation chambers. They mastered fire because fire would be their final tool, not for warmth, but for elimination. The hearthstones remain because stone doesn't burn. But everything else, every technique, every secret, every method that made their construction possible, disappeared into flames that burned hot enough to melt the truth itself. And when you understand what these men were really building around their perfect hearths, when you discover what activities required such elaborate preparation followed by such complete destruction, you'll realize that some fires weren't accidents. Some fires were signatures left by men who built their own funeral pyres and lit them willingly to protect secrets that were worth more than their lives. Because the greatest mystery isn't how they built hearths that sustained them through mountain winters. The mystery is why they built hearths capable of erasing every trace that they had ever existed at all. The journal entry stops mid-word. The ink's still fresh when they found it 20 years later. The final sentence reads, "Something approaches through the trees. I can hear footsteps, but I see nothing more." The pen dropped beside the page. The chair overturned. The cabin door standing open to wilderness that had swallowed another mountain man whole, leaving behind only questions and a life interrupted forever. This is a reality that waited inside the cabins we watched these men build with their blood, sweat, and genius. Perfect walls, masterful hearths, ingenious roofs. But within those walls lived men who walked the razor's edge between survival and madness every single day. Men whose daily routines balanced life-sustaining activities with a constant awareness that each sunset might be their last. The life within these cabins tells stories that construction techniques never could. Stories of human endurance pushed beyond all reasonable limits. Stories of minds that adapted to isolation so complete that sanity became negotiable. Stories of men who built architectural masterpieces, then discovered that living inside them demanded skills that no construction manual could teach. If you're fascinated by the psychological reality of extreme isolation and want to understand how these men maintained their humanity while living like hermits in the wilderness, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now. Share this with anyone who's ever wondered what it takes to survive completely alone. And tell me in the comments, how many days could you go without seeing another human being? Because these men counted those days and years, not hours. Let me take you inside the daily existence that tested human limits in ways that modern psychology is still trying to understand. Dawn arrived like a judge pronouncing sentence. Every morning brought the same brutal arithmetic of survival. Wood chopped or freeze to death. Water fetched or die of dehydration. Food procured or starve. Fire maintained or lose everything to coal that could kill in hours. But the morning ritual began before dawn, in darkness so complete that the mountain man navigated his own cabin by touch and memory. He moved through space he had created with his own hands. Yet darkness transformed familiar territory into obstacle courses where one misstep could mean injury that would prove fatal when no rescue existed. The coals from the night before held the difference between life and death. If they had died during his sleep, he faced a terrifying prospect of starting fire from scratch using flint, steel, and tinder while his breath froze into clouds and his fingers lost feeling. If the coals survived, he possessed a foundation for another day of existence. Feeding those coals back to flame became a ceremony of resurrection performed every morning for months or years without interruption. He added kindling with the precision of a surgeon, understanding that too much would smother the precious embers, too little would allow them to die. The first flames of each day weren't just fire. They were hope made visible, proof that he had survived another night in a place that killed men while they slept. Then came the water. Fetching water sounds simple until you understand the reality of mountain hydration in winter conditions. The nearest water source might be a mile away through snow that could swallow a manhole. Breaking ice thick enough to support his weight required tools and techniques that consumed energy he couldn't afford to waste. Carrying water back to his cabin meant traversing terrain that became more treacherous with each step, where one fall could spill life-sustaining liquid that couldn't be replaced until the next exhausting journey. But water meant more than hydration. It meant cooking, cleaning, medicine preparation, fire safety. Every drop carried multiple purposes, and wasting water meant risking death from thirst, hunger, infection, or flames that could consume everything he'd built. The mountain men developed carrying techniques that maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. They carved wooden buckets that wouldn't crack in freezing temperatures. They discovered insulation methods that prevented water from freezing during transport. They learned to melt snow efficiently without wasting precious fuel, understanding that snow contained much less water than its volume suggested, and required enormous energy expenditure to convert into usable liquid. But melting snow meant maintaining fires hot enough to convert ice to water without burning fuel faster than he could replace it. The mathematics of thermal efficiency became survival calculus that occupied constant mental energy. How much wood for how much heat for how much water for how many days of life? Wood chopping transformed from simple task into daily marathon of endurance that tested every muscle these men possessed. Each morning demanded enough fuel for cooking, heating, and emergency reserves that could sustain life if weather prevented venturing outside for days or weeks. But winter wood chopping meant working in conditions that made every swing of the axe a gamble against injury. Frozen timber that could shatter axes, snow-covered logs that concealed dangerous footing, ice formation that made gripping tools nearly impossible. Working alone meant that one accident, one moment of lost concentration, one tool failure could leave a man injured and helpless with no possibility of rescue or assistance. They chopped wood anyway, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant accepting defeat after investing everything in creating shelter that demanded constant fuel to justify its existence. The hunting rituals reveal the true psychological cost of mountain man survival. Tracking deer through wilderness that extended beyond every horizon. Following elk herds that migrated according to weather patterns only the animals understood. Stalking bears that possess superior senses, superior strength, and superior knowledge of terrain where humans remain forever outsiders. Each hunting expedition meant leaving the security of the cabin for dangers that could kill in 1,000 different ways. But staying in the cabin meant starvation, and starvation meant death just as certain as any wilderness predator. The mountain man learned to read animal behavior like prophecy. A broken twig revealed direction and timing of prey passage. Disturbed ground told stories about size, species, and intent. Scat analysis provided intelligence about diet, health, and territorial boundaries that could mean the difference between successful hunting and becoming prey yourself. But hunting alone meant confronting not just physical challenges, but psychological warfare against despair that accumulated like snowfall. Hours of patient stalking that produced no results. Days of tracking that led to empty clearings. Weeks of effort that yielded barely enough protein to justify the energy expenditure required to obtain it. The isolation during long hunts pushed minds toward breaking points that few humans ever experience. Miles from shelter, surrounded by wilderness that could deliver death without warning. Tracking animals that possessed every advantage except human intelligence and weapons, the mountain man entered psychological territory where sanity became luxury he couldn't afford. Yet some men thrived in this mental landscape. They developed tracking abilities that bordered on supernatural perception. They could predict animal behavior days in advance. They understood migration patterns, feeding schedules, and territorial boundaries with accuracy that rivaled the animals themselves. How did human minds adapt to isolation so complete that weeks could pass without seeing another living creature larger than a squirrel? How did men maintain psychological stability while living in conditions that would drive modern humans to mental breakdown within days? The evening ritual provides the answer and reveals the most disturbing aspect of mountain man psychology. Writing journals became the lifeline that connected these men to humanity they had abandoned. By candlelight or firelight, they recorded their daily experiences with detail that transformed routine survival into literature that still captivates readers today. They wrote about weather, hunting success, construction progress, and 1,000 small challenges that filled each day. But they also wrote about things that shouldn't have existed in empty wilderness. Listen to this journal entry, discovered in a cabin where the writer was found dead. The voice called my name again tonight, clear as church bells, coming from outside the eastern wall. When I looked, I saw nothing but shadows dancing in moonlight. But the voice knew my name. How does the wilderness learn the names of men it's never met? Another entry, found in different location. I'm not alone here. I build my walls, and something watches me build them. I hunt my prey, and something hunts alongside me. I tend my fire, and something shares its warmth. I should be terrified. Instead, I feel accompanied. These weren't hallucinations born of isolation. These were detailed observations recorded by men whose survival depended on accurate perception of their environment. Men trained to distinguish between real threats and imaginary dangers. Men whose lives required maintaining perfect mental clarity under conditions that would break lesser individuals. Yet their journals consistently describe presences, voices, helpers, and companions that archaeological evidence proves never existed in physical form. Unless they did exist. Unless the mountain men encountered something in the wilderness that official history has never acknowledged. Unless their perfect cabin construction attracted attention from inhabitants who preferred to remain hidden from civilization's expansion. But sometimes those journals ended mid-sentence, words trailing off as if something interrupted them forever. The pattern appears in journals discovered across the entire frontier. Complete entries describing normal daily activities followed by abrupt cessation of writing. Not gradual decline suggesting illness. Not increasing desperation indicating approaching death. Just sudden interruption as if the writer had been called away from his writing and never returned. The physical evidence of these sites defies explanation. Meals half prepared on tables. Tools laid out as if their owner intended to return within minutes. Fires banked for evening warmth. Doors left open to wilderness that had reclaimed everything except the words that stopped flowing from pens that would never write again. What called these men away from their evening writing rituals? What interrupted their documentation of daily survival with such sudden finality that they abandoned journals mid-sentence, meals mid-preparation, fires mid-tending? The answer lies hidden in the patterns that emerge when researchers map these interruption sites across the frontier. They don't occur randomly. They cluster around specific geographical features. They concentrate near construction sites where advanced building techniques appeared without explanation. They multiply in regions where cabin styles showed influences that shouldn't have existed in isolated wilderness locations. The mountain men weren't just living in their cabins. They were documenting something, recording observations, gathering intelligence, building detailed accounts of experiences that someone or something preferred to keep secret. And when their documentation became too detailed, too revealing, too dangerous to ignore, their journals ended forever. Because a life within those perfectly constructed cabins wasn't just about survival. It was about discovery, about witnessing, about recording evidence of things that official history claimed never existed. And when you understand what they were really documenting in those evening journal sessions, when you discover what they were witnessing that required such careful record keeping, you'll understand why some stories end mid-sentence. Some truths are too dangerous to finish writing. Some observations are too threatening to complete. Some discoveries require that the discoverer disappear along with his evidence, leaving behind only architectural masterpieces that stand as monuments to knowledge that died with their builders. The life within the cabin was never about the cabin. It was about what the cabin allowed these men to witness in the wilderness around them. And something in that wilderness decided that some witnesses had seen too much to survive. 6 months of darkness, 4 feet of snow that never melts, temperatures that turn exhaled breath into ice crystals before it leaves your lungs. And somewhere in this frozen hell, men live alone in wooden boxes they built with their own hands, counting days until spring like prisoners marking time until execution. Winter didn't just test the cabins these mountain men constructed. Winter tested whether the human mind could survive inside perfect architectural prisons where every day looked exactly like the last, where every sunrise brought the same deadly routine, where every sunset promised another night of fighting off madness that accumulated like snowfall, thick, silent, and suffocating. In snow this deep, no man left footprints. If one disappeared, the mountain buried him whole. But here's what makes mountain winter survival even more terrifying than you imagine. The men who built these cabins weren't just fighting weather. They were fighting their own minds, trapped inside shelters that protected their bodies while destroying their sanity. They were discovering that perfect construction could create perfect psychological torture chambers where isolation became a living nightmare that made death seem like mercy. If you want to understand how human minds survived months of complete isolation in conditions that would break most people within days, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Comment below and tell me the longest you've ever gone without human contact, because these men measured such periods not in hours but in seasons that stretch across entire calendar years. Let me show you how they stockpiled more than food for winter survival. They stockpiled hope, sanity, and reasons to stay alive when everything logical screamed that death would be easier than endurance. The stockpiling process began in late summer when mountain men faced mathematical calculations that determined whether they would see another spring. Food preservation without refrigeration, calorie computation without nutritional science, storage planning without any margin for error. They needed roughly 4,000 calories per day to survive mountain winters while maintaining the physical activity required for firewood gathering, water fetching, and basic cabin maintenance. 4,000 calories multiplied by 180 days of winter isolation meant procuring and preserving over 700,000 calories before the first snowfall made hunting impossible. But calories came disguised as live animals that possess superior winter survival instincts, intimate knowledge of terrain, and absolutely no interest in becoming human food sources. The mountain man faced the challenge of converting walking, breathing, intelligent creatures into stored protein, using nothing but primitive weapons, basic preservation techniques, and hunting skills that required perfection because failure meant starvation. Jerky production became the foundation of winter survival, but creating preserved meat demanded knowledge that extended far beyond simple cutting and drying. The mountain man had to understand which cuts of meat would preserve effectively, which salt concentrations prevented spoilage without making food inedible, which smoking techniques created preservation without destroying nutritional value. He learned that different animals required different preservation approaches. Venison jerky demanded thin slicing and extended drying times. Bear meat needed heavy salt treatment and careful fat removal. Elk required techniques that preserved massive quantities of protein while preventing waste that could attract scavengers capable of destroying entire food caches. But preservation also meant protection. Stored food attracted every carnivore within miles. Bears that could tear through cabin walls to reach cache meat. Wolves that could detect preserved food through layers of protection. Mountain cats that viewed human food stores as convenient hunting grounds where prey came pre-processed and defenseless. The mountain man learned to create cache systems that protected food from weather and wildlife simultaneously. Underground storage pits lined with stones and sealed with pine pitch. Elevated platforms that placed food beyond reach of terrestrial predators. Smoking houses that combined preservation with fortress-level security against hungry visitors. But even perfect food preservation couldn't solve the most dangerous aspect of winter stockpiling. The psychological impact of living surrounded by reminders that your survival depended on consuming dead animals while praying that you wouldn't join them. Small game trapping provided daily protein supplements that could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. But winter trapping demanded understanding animal behavior patterns that changed completely when snow transformed familiar landscapes into alien territories. The deadfall trap became the mountain man's primary small game weapon because it killed efficiently without requiring constant monitoring. But constructing effective deadfall traps required knowledge that bordered on animal psychology. understanding exactly where creatures would travel through snow-covered terrain, predicting which routes would remain possible when drifts blocked traditional pathways, calculating trigger sensitivities that would respond to target animals while ignoring wind, falling snow, and smaller creatures that would steal bait without providing useful protein. Each trap represented hours of construction time that could be invested elsewhere in survival activities. Each trap demanded daily checking that required venturing outside in weather that could kill within minutes of exposure. Each trap location required tactical thinking about predator territories, human scent dispersal, and bait placement that would attract prey without advertising human presence to larger threats. But the psychological cost of trapping exceeded its physical demands. Checking empty traps day after day. Finding traps destroyed by animals smarter than the men who built them. Discovering traps that had killed nothing except hope for variation in monotonous survival routines. The mountain men trapped anyway, because small game meant fresh meat, and fresh meat meant psychological relief from the preserved rations that sustained life without providing satisfaction. Now comes a part that reveals why winter was the most dangerous season for mountain men who had survived every other challenge the wilderness could deliver. Cabin walls groaning under blizzards created soundtracks of structural stress that played continuously for months. The constant creaking, settling, and flexing of wooden joints under massive snow loads created auditory environments where distinguishing between normal building movement and catastrophic failure required experience that some men never lived long enough to develop. But the groaning wasn't just structural. It was psychological warfare against minds that craved silence, variety, and relief from the constant reminder that tons of snow waited above their heads, held back only by timber joints they had crafted months earlier when mistakes could still be corrected. Listen to this journal entry, discovered in a cabin where the writer died during his third consecutive winter. The walls speak constantly now. They tell me about the weight they carry. They whisper about stress points that grow weaker each day. They argue among themselves about which joint will fail first. I have become referee to architectural conversations that never end. The writer of those words was Thomas Fitzpatrick, a veteran mountain man who had survived bear attacks, tribal conflicts, and injuries that would have killed lesser men. But winter isolation inside his own perfect construction drove him to psychological territories where cabin walls became conversational partners and structural sounds became voices that demanded attention. But here's what makes these winter psychological breaks even more disturbing. The men who succumbed to winter madness weren't weaklings or amateurs. They were experienced mountain men who had survived multiple seasons successfully. They possessed the skills, knowledge, and mental toughness that had carried them through challenges that killed their companions. Yet winter isolation inside their own cabins broke minds that wilderness dangers had never touched. Why did perfect shelter become perfect torture? Why did architectural success become psychological failure? Why did men who could build masterpieces lose their sanity living inside their own creations? The answer lies in understanding that humans weren't designed for the level of isolation that mountain cabins provided. Our minds require social interaction, environmental variety, and sensory stimulation that winter wilderness could never supply. The mountain men built shelters that protected their bodies while starving their consciousness of everything that made life bearable. But some men discovered coping mechanisms that allowed them to thrive during winter months that destroyed others. They developed internal worlds rich enough to sustain psychological health during external conditions that offered nothing but repetitive survival tasks and unending whiteness. They created mental architecture sophisticated as physical construction, internal narratives that provided entertainment during months when the external world offered only monotony, psychological frameworks that transformed isolation from torture into opportunity for self-discovery that civilization could never provide. Yet even these psychological masters faced challenges that tested human adaptability beyond all reasonable limits. The ghost cabins tell stories that survivors never could. Structures discovered years later with everything preserved exactly as their occupants had left them. Food still stacked on shelves. Fires still laid in hearths. Personal belongings still arranged as if their owners had stepped outside for moments and would return shortly. But the owners never returned. They vanished completely, leaving behind architectural time capsules that preserve their final moments like museum exhibits dedicated to unsolved mysteries. In 1847, a survey team discovered a cabin in remote Colorado wilderness that had remained sealed for at least 5 years. Inside, they found winter food supplies still perfectly preserved. Smoked meat hanging from rafters showed no signs of decay. Root vegetables stored in underground cellars remained fresh enough to eat. Preserved berries maintained flavor and nutritional value that suggested recent preparation. But there was no occupant, no body, no signs of struggle or accident or violence. No indication that anyone had lived in the cabin for years, except that someone had obviously lived there recently enough to leave fresh food supplies arranged for immediate consumption. The survey team found something else that defied explanation. The cabin door had been barred from the inside. Heavy wooden beams secured against internal brackets made external entry impossible without demolishing the door structure. Yet the cabin was empty when they forced entry from outside. How does a man bar his door from inside, then vanish without leaving through that same door? The logical explanations crumble under examination. Suicide would have left a body. Accident would have left evidence. Illness would have left signs of decline. Escape through windows was impossible because the windows were also barred from inside. The only physical evidence was the food, perfectly preserved, recently prepared, arranged as if someone had been eating meals there within days of the discovery. Unless time worked differently inside those cabins, unless winter isolation created conditions where normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied, unless the men who built these architectural masterpieces discovered something about the nature of reality that living alone in perfect isolation allowed them to perceive. Because when you study the ghost cabin discoveries carefully, when you analyze the preservation patterns and timing inconsistencies, when you understand that fresh food doesn't remain fresh for years without explanation, you realize these cabins weren't abandoned. They were occupied by something that left no footprints, cast no shadows, and required no doors to enter or exit spaces designed to keep the wilderness outside. The mountain men built perfect shelters and discovered they weren't sheltering alone. Something shared those cabins during winter months that lasted longer than seasons should last. Something that consumed food without leaving evidence. Something that remained after the builders had vanished into mysteries that winter snow buried deeper than graves. And when spring arrived, when search parties finally reached these remote locations, when they forced open doors that had been sealed from inside, they found monuments to human construction filled with evidence that humans were no longer the only inhabitants. The question isn't how these men survived winter isolation. The question is what survived the winters with them, and whether those companions were the reason some mountain men never emerged when spring finally melted the snow that had held them prisoner in their own architectural masterpieces. The scratches on the inside of the cabin door told a story that no living man could explain. Deep gouges in solid wood, patterns that suggested desperate clawing, marks that started at eye level and descended toward the floors as someone or something had been dragging itself downward while trying to escape from inside a locked room. But the door had been barred from the outside when they found it. The cabin empty for years. The scratches fresh enough to show raw wood beneath weathered surfaces. Someone had been trapped inside that cabin, fighting to get out, while the wilderness held them prisoner in architectural perfection that had become an architectural tomb. And the most disturbing part? The scratches were made by human fingernails. Welcome to the psychological battleground where mountain men discovered that their perfect cabin could protect them from everything except their own minds. Where isolation so complete that months passed without human contact transformed shelter into madness chambers where reality became negotiable and sanity became luxury they couldn't afford to maintain. If you want to understand how human consciousness breaks down in perfect isolation, and why some mountain men found company in empty cabins where no company should have existed, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell right now. Share this with anyone who's ever felt truly alone, and tell me in the comments, what's the strangest thing you've ever experienced when you thought you were completely by yourself? Because these men discovered that being alone doesn't always mean being alone. Let me take you inside minds that adapted to solitude so extreme that distinguishing between reality and hallucination became impossible and maybe unnecessary. The human brain requires social stimulation to maintain normal function. Conversation, facial recognition, emotional exchange, and interactive communication form the foundation of mental health that most people never question because most people never live without these basic psychological nutrients. But mountain men lived without human contact for months that stretched into years. Their brains, starved of social input, began creating substitute experiences to fill a void that isolation carved into their consciousness. They started hearing voices that spoke with perfect clarity. They began seeing companions who offered comfort, advice, and assistance during moments when assistance meant the difference between survival and death. The phenomenon appears consistently in mountain man journals discovered across the entire frontier. Cabin fever describes a distressing irritability or restlessness experience when a person is stuck at an isolated location for extended periods. But the mountain men experience something far more complex than simple restlessness. They experience psychological reconstruction of reality itself. Listen to this journal entry, discovered in a cabin where the writer was found dead. My evening companion arrived again tonight. He sits in the corner chair and discusses a day's hunting with knowledge that surpasses my own. He knows where the elk will winter, which streams will freeze first, how much snow will fall before spring returns. His advice has kept me alive through challenges that should have killed me weeks ago. The writer continues, I know he cannot be real. I built this cabin alone. I live here alone. I have seen no human tracks in snow that shows every creature's passage. Yet his presence feels more solid than the walls around me, more reliable than the fire that warms me, more necessary than the food that sustains me. But here's where these psychological adaptations become genuinely terrifying. The companion described in Mountain Man Journal possessed knowledge that the isolated men shouldn't have had access to. They provided hunting advice that proved accurate. They offered weather predictions that saved lives. They suggested construction modifications that improved shelter efficiency. They delivered information that helped mountain men survive challenges that should have killed them. How do hallucinations provide survival intelligence that exceeds the knowledge of the men experiencing them? Modern psychology suggests that isolation-induced hallucinations often represent the mind's attempt to access subconscious knowledge through externalized voices. The mountain man's subconscious observations, accumulated through years of wilderness experience, manifested as advisory companions who could articulate survival wisdom that conscious thought couldn't organize effectively. But that explanation collapses when you examine the specific advice these companions provided. They warned about weather patterns that materialized exactly as predicted. They identified animal behavior changes that indicated approaching dangers. They suggested tactical modifications to hunting strategies that improved success rates dramatically. They provided geographical guidance that led mountain men to water sources, game concentrations, and safe passage routes through terrain they had never explored before. Subconscious knowledge doesn't exceed conscious experience. Hallucinations don't provide information that the hallucinating mind never possessed. Yet Mountain Man journals consistently describe companions who demonstrated knowledge that transcended anything the isolated men could have learned through personal observation. Unless these weren't hallucinations at all. Unless isolation so extreme that it severed connections to civilized reality allowed mountain men to perceive things that crowded minds never notice. Unless perfect silence revealed voices that constant noise normally drowns out. Unless architectural isolation created conditions where barriers between visible and invisible became permeable. The Native American tribes who inhabited these mountains possessed folklore that white settlers dismiss as primitive superstition. Stories of mountain spirits who appeared to travelers in distress. Legends of helpful presences who guided lost hunters to safety. Traditions that described invisible inhabitants who shared the wilderness with physical beings but remained hidden except when isolation or desperation created openings for contact. But the mountain men weren't familiar with tribal folklore. They arrived in the wilderness carrying European skepticism about supernatural phenomena. They possessed no cultural framework for understanding experiences that didn't fit rational explanations. Yet their journals describe encounters that precisely match Native American accounts of mountain spirit interactions. How do isolated white trappers independently develop experiences that exactly parallel indigenous spiritual traditions they had never encountered? The answer appears in the physical evidence that survivors left behind. Evidence that suggests these psychological adaptations produced measurable results in the physical world. The transformation happened overnight. One day, a lone cabin stood sentinel against empty wilderness. The next day, wagons rolled past its doorway. Families emerged from their covers to wave at the hermit who had carved civilization from chaos, and suddenly the man who had built his shelter to escape humanity found himself surrounded by the very thing he had fled. But some mountain men welcomed the invasion. Others vanished the moment civilization approached their doorsteps, abandoning architectural masterpieces they had spent years perfecting to disappear deeper into wilderness that would never be mapped, never be settled, never be found. The question that haunts every researcher who studies mountain man settlements isn't how these lone cabins evolve into thriving communities. The question is why some builders embraced the transformation while others chose to vanish rather than share the spaces they had created with their own blood and genius. And the answer reveals a truth about human nature that civilization has spent centuries trying to hide. If you're fascinated by how individual survival shelters became the foundations of entire communities and want to understand why some mountain men became legends while others became mysteries, subscribe right now and ring that notification bell. Share this with anyone who's ever wondered about the psychology of hermits who choose solitude over society, and tell me in the comments, would you rather live completely alone or surrounded by people who don't understand you? Because these mountain men face that exact choice, and their decisions shape American history in ways that textbooks never acknowledge. Let me show you how architectural masterpieces built for one became homes for thousands, and why some builders preferred death to sharing their creations. The transition from solitary cabin to community hub began with geography, not sociology. Mountain men built their shelters in locations that offered strategic advantages: water access, hunting grounds, natural protection from weather, defensive positions against potential threats. But these same geographical advantages attracted other travelers, other settlers, other men seeking the same survival benefits that informed cabin placement decisions. William sublet opened fort trading posts along the Oregon Trail to serve the remnant fur trade and the settlers heading west, transforming his personal wilderness retreat into a commercial enterprise that generated wealth from location rather than isolation. His cabin walls, originally designed to protect one man from mountain dangers, became the foundation for a business empire that connected wilderness survival with civilized commerce. But Sublet's transformation wasn't accidental. Archaeological evidence suggests that his original cabin construction incorporated design elements that anticipated future expansion. Doorways positioned to accommodate multiple entry points. Foundation stones arranged to support additional structures. Room layouts that could be modified to serve commercial rather than residential purposes. How did a man-building shelter for solitary survival incorporate design features for community development that wouldn't be needed for years or decades into the future? The answer lies in understanding that some mountain men weren't escaping civilization. They were establishing the advance guard for civilization's expansion. They were creating foothold positions in wilderness territories that official exploration had never penetrated. They were building architectural seeds that would grow into communities capable of supporting westward migration on scales that government planners could never organize. These men weren't hermits. They were architects of empire building disguised as solitary survivors. The trading post-evolution revealed construction planning that exceeded individual survival requirements. Single-room cabins expanded into complex compounds featuring storage facilities, workshop spaces, meeting areas, and accommodation quarters for travelers who arrived with specific expectations about frontier hospitality. But expansion required construction techniques that transcended the log cabin methods we watched these men master in previous chapters. Trading posts demanded architectural solutions for problems that isolated cabins never faced. Multiple families living in connected spaces. Commercial activities requiring specialized storage and workspace designs. Defense considerations for protecting valuable trade goods from thieves who viewed wilderness outposts as convenient robbery targets. The mountain men who successfully transitioned from hermit to community leader possessed construction knowledge that prepared them for challenges they hadn't yet encountered. They understood foundation principles that could support multiple structures. They mastered utility systems that could serve expanding populations. They anticipated infrastructure needs that wouldn't become apparent until communities actually formed around their original cabin sites. Where did solitary mountain men acquire urban planning skills that university-trained architects struggle to master today? The stories of families joining mountain men reveal the human cost of transformation from isolation to community. These weren't romantic reunions between long-separated loved ones. These were cultural collisions between men who had adapted to wilderness psychology and family members who expected them to readjust to civilized behavior patterns they had abandoned years earlier. Listen to this account from the journal of Jedediah Smith's wife, discovered after her death. He speaks to empty corners as her companions wait there. He saves portions of meals for guests who never arrive. He maintains sleeping spaces for visitors who exist only in his wilderness-trained mind. I have not regained my husband. I have inherited a stranger who wears his face. The psychological adaptation required for extreme isolation created mental frameworks that couldn't be easily reversed when social situations demanded normal human interaction. Mountain men who had learned to find company in shadows, conversation in cabin sounds, and companionship in hallucinated presences couldn't simply abandon these coping mechanisms when real people required attention. Family integration often failed catastrophically. Wives who couldn't adapt to men who had been fundamentally changed by years of solitude. Children who feared fathers who seemed more comfortable with invisible companions and flesh and blood relatives. Parents who couldn't recognize sons who had disappeared into wilderness and returned as psychological strangers wearing familiar faces. But some families succeeded in bridging the gap between wilderness psychology and civilized expectations. They learned to accommodate the quirks, habits, and mental adaptations that had kept their mountain men alive during years when death waited behind every decision. They created household routines that honored both civilized requirements and wilderness-trained instincts. These successful family integrations produced something extraordinary. Hybrid communities that combined mountain survival skills with civilized social structures. Settlements that could thrive in wilderness conditions while maintaining cultural traditions that connected them to broader American society. Cabin doors found scratched from the inside tell stories that journal entries couldn't complete. The scratches show patterns of desperate attempt to escape from sealed rooms. But the scratches were made by fingernails that had grown long during months of isolation. Fingernails that belonged to men who had no reason to try escaping from their own shelters unless those shelters had been compromised by something that made staying inside more dangerous than facing winter wilderness without protection. But the doors were barred from outside when discovery teams arrived, which means someone or something had sealed these men inside their own cabins, then disappeared without leaving tracks in snow that preserved every footprint for months. The scratches weren't made by men trying to escape from nothing. They were made by men trying to escape from something that had entered their architectural sanctuaries and transformed shelter into captivity. Something that left no physical evidence except the psychological trauma recorded in journal entries that ended when escape attempts failed and mountain men realized they would never leave their perfect cabins alive. The folklore of mountain spirits takes on terrifying new meaning when you understand that isolated minds didn't create these encounters. Isolated minds simply became capable of perceiving encounters that had always existed but remained invisible to consciousness cluttered with civilized distractions. The mountain men built perfect architectural isolation chambers, and perfect isolation revealed that they had never been alone in the wilderness. They had just been too busy, too connected to their own kind, too surrounded by human noise to notice the other inhabitants who shared the mountains with them. But months of silence, weeks without human contact, days of perfect stillness inside architectural masterpieces opened a perception to companions who had been waiting patiently for human minds to become quiet enough to acknowledge their presence. Did the mountains break their minds, or was something truly there with them? The evidence suggests both answers are correct. The mountains did break their minds because something was truly there with them. Something that required broken minds to establish contact. Something that waited for human consciousness to fracture under isolation stress before revealing itself to men who had become psychologically equipped to accept impossible realities. The company of shadows wasn't hallucination. It was invitation. And the mountain men who accepted that invitation discovered that their architectural masterpieces had been constructed not just as shelter from the wilderness, but as meeting places where human isolation became deep enough to accommodate visitors who existed in spaces between reality and imagination. The scratched doors marked the places where some mountain men tried to return to the human world after discovering they preferred the company they found in perfect solitude. But their visitors had other plans. Plans that required keeping their new companions permanently isolated from civilization that would never understand what lived in the spaces between human perception and mountain reality. The scratches stopped when the escape attempts ended, and the mountain men learned to accept that they had built their cabins perfectly for inhabitants they had never intended to house but could never evict once isolation made them welcome. The contrast between silent wilderness and growing settlements created psychological tension that some mountain men couldn't resolve. They had built their cabins to escape human noise, human demands, human expectations that felt like chains around minds that had learned to roam free across internal landscapes as vast as the external wilderness they inhabited. Suddenly, their architectural sanctuaries filled with conversation, laughter, arguments, and all the social friction that accompanies human community. The silence they had fought to preserve vanished beneath layers of civilized sound that reminded them constantly of everything they had fled into the mountains to escape. Some mountain men adapted to the transformation. They became community leaders, successful businessmen, respected citizens whose wilderness experience provided leadership qualities that frontier communities desperately needed. They used their construction knowledge to build not just additional cabins, but entire settlement infrastructures that could support populations that grew faster than anyone anticipated. But others couldn't make the psychological transition from solitude to society. They abandoned their architectural masterpieces rather than share them with people who would never understand the isolation, desperation, and psychological extremes that had been required to create those perfect shelters. They walked away from cabins that represented years of their lives, months of their labor, and all of their wilderness survival knowledge. They left behind architectural legacies that would save communities for generations while they disappeared into deeper wilderness that offered the isolation their minds required to function. But for every cabin that became a home, others became graves, swallowed by vines and silence. The abandoned cabins tell stories that successful communities never could. Archaeological sites where perfect construction slowly surrenders to natural reclamation. Abandoned homes where nature's takeover through overgrown paths adds eerie beauty to architectural achievements that no longer serve human purposes. But these aren't random abandonment patterns. Research reveals that cabin abandonment clusters around specific geographical features, specific time periods, and specific construction styles that suggest coordinated rather than individual decisions to leave. The evidence points to mass evacuations that official records never documented. Entire networks of mountain men abandoning their cabins simultaneously, as if responding to warnings that history never recorded. But warnings about what? What could threaten men who had survived everything the wilderness could deliver? What could drive master builders away from shelters they had created to withstand any challenge nature could present? The answer lies hidden in the timing patterns that emerge when historians map abandonment dates across frontier regions. The evacuation began in 1847, the same year that California gold rush fever started drawing thousands of prospectors westward. But these weren't economic migrations. The abandoned cabins show no signs of hasty departure or emergency evacuation. Personal belongings remained neatly arranged. Food supplies stayed properly stored. Tools were left in perfect working condition. These were planned departures by men who intended never to return. But planned departures required destinations, and the mountain men who abandoned their cabins didn't migrate to gold fields or settlement communities. They vanished completely, leaving no traces in civilization's expanding records. They stepped out of history as deliberately as they had originally stepped into wilderness. Where did master builders who could create architectural marvels in impossible conditions go when they abandoned the fruits of their labor? The folklore provides clues that official history refuses to acknowledge. Native American tribal accounts describe mountain men who walked between worlds, who could appear and disappear at will, who possessed knowledge that connected them to spirit realms that physical reality couldn't contain. But these weren't supernatural transformations. These were psychological evolutions that extreme isolation had made possible. Men who had learned to perceive realities that civilized minds filtered out. Men who had developed consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations through years of living in conditions that forced their awareness into territories that most people never explore. The communities that grew around mountain man cabins inherited more than architectural foundations. They inherited techniques, knowledge, and construction methods that had been refined through survival pressures that no construction school could replicate. They received practical education in wilderness mastery from men who had earned their expertise through trials that tested every aspect of human capability. But they also inherited mysteries that community life couldn't solve. Residents of settlements built around original mountain man cabins reported consistent strange experiences. Voices heard in empty rooms. Footsteps recorded in spaces where no one walked. Doors that opened and closed without human operation. Food that disappeared without explanation. Tools that moved to different locations overnight. The growing communities attributed the phenomena to mountain man spirits who couldn't abandon cabins they had built with such personal investment. But the experiences continued for decades, across multiple generations of residents who had never known the original builders. These weren't memories or tributes to dead hermits. These were ongoing interactions with something that had shared those cabins with the mountain men, and remained after the builders moved on to other projects in deeper wilderness. The architectural legacy of mountain man construction extends far beyond individual cabins or trading posts. Their techniques influence settlement patterns, building codes, and construction standards across the entire American frontier. Modern log cabin construction still employs joints, foundation methods, and weatherproofing techniques that mountain men developed through trial and error in conditions where errors meant death. But their psychological legacy tells a different story. A story about human minds that expanded beyond civilized limitations through extreme isolation. A story about consciousness that learned to perceive realities that community life renders invisible. A story about men who discovered that perfect solitude opened doorways to experiences that civilization closes. The towns that grew around mountain man cabins inherited both the benefits and the costs of that expanded awareness. They gained construction knowledge that enabled them to build settlements capable of thriving in wilderness conditions. But they also gained exposure to phenomena that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. Some communities embraced the mysteries that came with their mountain man heritage. They learned to accommodate strange experiences as normal aspects of life in places where normal rules didn't apply. They developed cultural framework for understanding encounters that couldn't be explained through conventional logic. But other communities rejected the psychological inheritance that accompanied their architectural legacy. They sought to civilize spaces that had been designed for men whose minds operated beyond civilized parameters. They tried to impose normal social structures on locations that had been shaped by individuals whose isolation had transformed them into something beyond normal human categories. These civilizing efforts often failed catastrophically. Communities that tried to eliminate the mysterious aspects of their mountain man heritage found themselves struggling with inexplicable problems. Construction projects that failed without apparent cause. Settlement patterns that collapsed despite adequate resources and planning. Social structures that disintegrated when exposed to influences that originated in the psychological territories their mountain man founders had explored. The legacy of their hands wasn't just architectural. It was consciousness expanding. And consciousness, once expanded, creates ripple effects that influence every subsequent human activity in locations where expansion occurred. The abandoned cabins that became overgrown monuments to vanished builders preserve more than construction techniques. They preserve evidence of human potential that most people never realize they possess. They stand as proof that individual determination can create architectural achievements that outlast the civilizations that produce them. But they also preserve warnings about the psychological costs of pushing human consciousness beyond limits that evolution designed to protect mental stability. They remind us that perfect isolation can expand awareness in directions that make returning to normal human community impossible or unbearable. The vines that slowly consume abandoned mountain man cabins aren't just natural reclamation. They are nature's way of sealing doorways that were opened by human minds operating under extreme conditions. They are protective barriers that prevent casual explorers from accessing psychological territories that require specialized preparation to navigate safely. The cabins that became communities prove that some mountain men successfully managed a transition from expanded consciousness back to social functionality. They demonstrate that wilderness-trained awareness can be channeled into community leadership that combines survival expertise with civilized social skills. But the cabins that became graves remind us that some expansions of human consciousness can't be reversed. Some psychological territories, once explored, make return to normal human limitations impossible. Some mountain men built their cabins knowing they would never leave them alive because leaving would require abandoning awareness that had become more valuable than life itself. The legacy of their hands extends far beyond anything they built with wood and stone. Their real legacy lives in the proof that human consciousness can adapt to conditions that seem impossible, can expand to accommodate realities that seem supernatural, and can create experiences that transcend everything civilization teaches us about the limits of individual human potential. But that legacy comes with a warning carved into every abandoned cabin, scratched into every door that was sealed from inside, whispered through every community that inherited more than they bargained for when they built upon foundations that mountain men had laid. Some human potential should remain unexplored. Some consciousness expansion leads to territories where return becomes impossible. Some architectural achievements mark the boundaries between human limitation and something that lies beyond human categories entirely. The mountain men found those boundaries. They crossed them deliberately, and they left behind cabins that serve as monuments to what lies waiting in the spaces where human consciousness meets the infinite wilderness of unexplored reality. Whether those monuments inspire or warn depends on whether you're prepared to discover what human awareness becomes when it's freed from every limitation that civilization imposes to keep consciousness safely contained within manageable boundaries. Because the legacy of their hands isn't just about what they built. It's about what they became when building in perfect isolation transformed them into something that could no longer be contained within the civilized categories they had originally fled to escape. The coffee cup still steams. After 73 years of mountain weather, after decades of snow that should have buried everything, after seasons that destroyed metal and rotted wood, the ceramic mug sits on a handmade table inside a cabin that time forgot, and steam rises from coffee that was poured this morning by hands that turned to dust before your grandfather was born. This is what researchers discovered in 1891 when they finally reached the remote Colorado cabin that Jacob Mueller had built in 1818. The door stood open. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed with recent attention. Personal belongings lay arranged as if their owner had stepped outside for minutes and would return momentarily. But Jacob Mueller had vanished 73 years earlier, leaving behind architectural perfection that had somehow maintained itself through 3/4 of a century without human presence. The steaming coffee defied every law of physics, chemistry, and time itself. Yet it was there, witnessed, documented, photographed, real. How does coffee stay hot for 73 years? How does absence maintain presence? How do ghost cabins preserve moments that should have died with the men who created them? If you're ready to discover the most disturbing mystery of the American frontier, if you want to understand why some cabins became monuments to men who never truly left them, hit that like button right now and subscribe for content that will challenge everything you think you know about death, disappearance, and the architectural afterlife of mountain men who built shelters that outlasted their builders in ways that logic cannot explain. Ring that notification bell because what you're about to witness will haunt your dreams and change how you see abandoned places forever. And drop a comment below. Have you ever entered an empty building that didn't feel empty? Because across America, ghost cabins wait in wilderness locations where emptiness refuses to remain empty. Welcome to the final chapter of our journey into mountain man architecture. But this isn't about construction techniques or survival skills or engineering mastery. This is about what happens when perfect building creates perfect preservation of moments that should have ended when their creators drew their final breaths. The ghost cabins of America tell stories that the living never could. They stand scattered across wilderness regions where modern maps show nothing but empty space. Hidden valleys where satellite imagery reveals only forest canopy. Remote mountain locations accessible only to hikers willing to risk everything for the chance to witness architectural impossibilities that shouldn't exist but do. Each discovery begins the same way. Explorers following rumors, researchers chasing legends, adventurers seeking proof of stories that sound too incredible to believe. They trek through wilderness that has reclaimed every trail, navigate terrain that offers no guidelines except compass directions and stubborn determination. They push through vegetation that has grown wild for generations, cross streams that have changed course dozens of times, climb elevations that test endurance and reward persistence with views that take breath away. Then they see it. Smoke rising from a chimney that shouldn't be connected to fire. Windows glowing with lamplight in cabins that maps claim don't exist. Doors standing open to welcome visitors who arrive decades or centuries after anyone should be home to greet them. The Thornton cabin discovery in 1923 established a pattern that would repeat across America for the next century. A geological survey team working in remote Montana wilderness noticed smoke rising from a location where their map showed only uninhabited forest. Following the smoke led them to a log cabin of extraordinary craftsmanship, with walls that exhibited joinery techniques that surpassed anything frontier construction should have achieved. But the cabin was empty. No occupant. No recent signs of habitation. No explanation for smoke that had drawn them across 5 miles of trackless wilderness to discover architecture that existed when nothing should have been built. Inside, they found evidence of interrupted daily life. A meal half prepared on the kitchen table. Fresh bread cooling on wooden shelves. Hunting gear arranged for immediate use. Personal belongings positioned as if their owner had stepped outside momentarily and would return shortly to resume activities that had been paused, not abandoned. The food was fresh, the bread still warm. The hunting gear showed recent cleaning and maintenance. But dust patterns on window sills told a different story. Layers of accumulation that suggested years of abandonment. Dirt that had settled according to weather patterns that required extended time periods to create the archaeological layers that contradicted everything else they observed inside the cabin. How do fresh meals exist inside buildings that show years of abandonment? How does recently baked bread appear in kitchens where dust accumulation suggests no one has cooked for decades? The survey team documented everything. Measurements, photographs, detailed descriptions of every artifact they discovered. They returned to civilization with evidence that challenged rational explanation. But when they organized a return expedition to conduct more thorough investigation, they found nothing. No cabin, no clearing, no foundation stones, no architectural evidence that anything had ever been built in the location they had carefully mapped and documented just months earlier. The forest had reclaimed space where impossible architecture had stood. Trees grew in soil where cabin foundations should have remained. Vegetation patterns showed no disruption, no disturbance, no indication that human construction had ever altered the natural landscape. But the photograph remained. The measurements survived. The documentation proved that something extraordinary had existed in wilderness that refused to acknowledge its presence when investigators returned for verification. This became the pattern that defined ghost cabin encounters for the next century. Discovery followed by documentation followed by disappearance. Evidence gathered by credible witnesses who returned to find that credible evidence had vanished into landscape that swallowed architectural impossibilities as efficiently as it absorbed morning mist. But some cabins refused to vanish. They remained precisely where initial discovery had placed them, welcoming repeated visits from researchers who came seeking explanations for phenomena that explanations couldn't contain. These permanent ghost cabins offered opportunity for extended investigation that revealed details more disturbing than complete disappearance. The Morrison cabin stands in Wyoming wilderness where no roads reach, where no trails lead, where access requires expedition-level planning and equipment. Discovered in 1934, documented continuously since initial investigation, it represents the most thoroughly studied example of mountain man architectural preservation that science cannot explain. Every detail inside the Morrison cabin suggests recent habitation by an occupant who maintains a structure with devotional care. Fresh-cut firewood stacked with geometric precision. Tools arranged in workshop spaces with organizational efficiency that speaks of daily use. Furniture positioned to accommodate someone who continues living inside architectural space that should have been abandoned when its builder died in 1854. But thermal imaging reveals no heat signatures inside the cabin. Motion detectors record no movement within the structure. Security cameras show no entry or exit activity despite evidence that someone tends fires, arranges belongings, and maintains a cabin with meticulous attention to detail. The Morrison cabin is occupied by an occupant who leaves no evidence of occupation except perfect preservation that requires continuous human care. Researchers have documented the phenomenon for over 90 years. They've installed monitoring equipment that records data contradicting what their eyes observe. They conducted experiments that prove impossibility while photographing evidence that proves impossibility is irrelevant when ghost cabins define their own rules about presence, absence, and the architectural afterlife of mountain men who refuse to abandon masterpieces they created with their lives. But the Morrison cabin represents just one example of architectural haunting that operates according to principles that physics hasn't discovered. Across America, ghost cabins preserve moments that logic claimed should have ended when their builders drew final breaths in isolation that transformed architectural achievement into eternal responsibility. The pattern appears everywhere mountain men once lived. In 1976, the Unwind cabin was chosen by the U.S. Department of Interior to be included in the National Register of Historic Places because of its unique and realistic portrayal of frontier living conditions. But the Unwind cabin tells a story that national historic status never acknowledged. Visitors consistently report experiences that suggest the cabin's original occupant never learned that death means departure from architectural spaces you've invested your soul in creating. They hear chopping sound from workshop areas where no wood waits to be split. They smell cooking food from kitchen spaces where no ingredients have been placed. They observe tool movements in work areas where no hands guide implements that arrange themselves according to purposes only their original owner understands. The Unwind cabin hosts a mountain man who died over a century ago but continues performing daily maintenance routines that keep his architectural masterpiece functioning exactly as he designed it to serve his survival needs that death hasn't eliminated. But these aren't isolated phenomena affecting single cabins scattered randomly across wilderness regions. Research reveals clustering patterns that suggest coordinated haunting activities. Ghost cabins appear in geographical groupings that form networks of architectural preservation spanning multiple states and mountain ranges. The networks follow patterns that match historical mountain man territory claims, trading routes, and seasonal migration patterns, as if the men who built these cabins continue operating according to frontier social structures that death transformed but didn't terminate. As if mountain man communities persist in architectural spaces where physical death becomes irrelevant to social responsibilities that outlast the bodies that originally accepted them. But why do some mountain man cabins become ghost preservations while others crumble into ruins that nature reclaims without resistance? What determines which architectural achievements deserve eternal maintenance while others surrender to decay that erases every trace of their builders' accomplishments? The answer appears in construction quality that separated master builders from amateur survivors. The ghost cabins represent the finest examples of mountain man architectural achievement. Perfect joinery that required decades to master. Foundation techniques that demonstrated engineering knowledge beyond frontier education levels. Roof systems that showed mathematical precision that illiterate trappers shouldn't have possessed. These weren't ordinary survival shelters. These were architectural masterpieces that transcended mere function to achieve artistic perfection, that demanded preservation regardless of whether their creators remain alive to appreciate their accomplishments. The mountain men who achieved this level of construction quality invested more than labor in their buildings. They invested identity, purpose, and psychological attachment that created bonds stronger than death itself. Their cabins became extensions of their consciousness, external manifestations of internal mastery that couldn't be abandoned just because biological processes had reached natural conclusions. But ghost cabin preservation isn't limited to maintaining architectural integrity. The phenomenon extends to preserving entire lifestyle patterns that mountain men had developed during years of wilderness isolation. Daily routines continue inside cabins where no one lives. Seasonal preparations proceed according to schedules that no calendar marks. Annual cycles repeat with precision that suggests time moves differently inside architectural spaces where eternity has replaced mortality as a governing principle. The artifact preservation tells stories that words cannot adequately describe. Personal belongings arranged with care that indicates ongoing attention from owners who continue valuing possessions that should have become historical curiosities when their utility ended with their users' deaths. Clothing maintained in condition that suggests regular wearing by wearers who no longer require protection from elements that no longer threaten bodies that no longer exist. But the most disturbing artifacts are the journals that continue recording entries written in handwriting that matches historical samples from their deceased authors. New pages filled with observations about weather patterns, hunting conditions, and daily activities that suggest mountain man documentation continues long after mountain men have transformed from living observers into observing spirits who refuse to stop witnessing wilderness changes that unfold across decades and centuries. The journals record information that no living person could verify, weather predictions that prove accurate months before conditions develop, animal behavior observations that describe wildlife patterns in remote regions where no researcher travels, geographical changes that document landscape evolution across timescales that individual human lives cannot span. Yet the handwriting matches. The knowledge demonstrates continuity with historical mountain man expertise. The information proves valuable to researchers who study these entries despite their impossible origins. How do dead men continue writing journals? How do vanished mountain men document observations about regions they no longer physically inhabit? How do ghost cabin occupants maintain knowledge that grows more accurate instead of becoming obsolete as decades pass without living contact with changing conditions? The answer lies in understanding that mountain men who achieved architectural perfection in wilderness isolation had already transcended normal human limitations before death offered them opportunities to transcend mortality itself. Their consciousness had expanded beyond physical boundaries through years of extreme solitude that prepared them for existence that continued after biological existence concluded. They had learned to live outside normal reality. Death simply formalized arrangements they had been practicing for years. But ghost cabin preservation comes with costs that living visitors discover when they venture inside architectural spaces where normal rules about presence and absence have been suspended. Temperatures that change without cause. Shadows that move independently of light sources. Sounds that suggest activity in rooms where no activity should be possible. The psychological impact of ghost cabin visitation affects every explorer who experiences architectural haunting firsthand. These aren't tourist attractions or museum exhibits or historical curiosities. These are active living spaces where mountain men continue pursuing daily routines that death hasn't interrupted. Visitors become witnesses to impossible continuation of lives that should have ended. They observe meal preparation, tool maintenance, construction projects, and household management performed by occupants who acknowledge visitor presence while continuing activities that prove presence doesn't require physical form to achieve practical results. But acknowledgement comes with expectations. Ghost cabin occupants seem to anticipate that visitors will understand the rules that govern architectural afterlife, respect for ongoing daily routines, appreciation for construction achievements that required lifetime dedication, recognition that these spaces remain private homes where privacy must be honored despite inhabitant invisibility. Visitors who demonstrate appropriate respect report welcoming experiences where ghost cabin occupants share knowledge about wilderness survival, construction techniques, and mountain life that enhances visitor understanding of frontier history. But visitors who treat ghost cabins as empty curiosities discover that architectural afterlife includes defensive capabilities that can make trespassers regret their disrespectful intrusion. Several expedition teams have reported equipment malfunctions that prevented documentation of ghost cabin interiors, cameras that stopped functioning inside specific rooms, recording devices that captured only static in locations where conversation was clearly audible, measurement tools that provided readings contradicting direct observation of architectural dimensions. The ghost cabins actively resist examination by visitors whose intentions fail to meet standards that occupants enforce through methods that don't require physical interaction to produce physical results. But the most chilling discovery awaits explorers who remain inside ghost cabins after sunset, because daylight visitation reveals architectural preservation. Nighttime occupancy reveals architectural animation by presences that become more active when darkness provides privacy for activities that daylight observation would complicate. The nighttime sounds begin with familiar frontier activities: firewood being chopped outside cabin walls, water being drawn from wells that maps show no longer exist, hunting gear being prepared for expeditions that follow routes through wilderness that has changed completely since original cabin construction. But the sounds intensify into activities that suggest ghost cabin occupants continue pursuing projects that death interrupted before completion. Construction noises from workshop areas where new building projects apparently proceed according to plans that physical limitations no longer restrict. Architectural expansion that adds rooms, improves existing structures, and demonstrates construction capabilities that transcend anything living mountain men had achieved. The ghost cabins grow larger overnight. New additions appear between visits that documented previous architectural configurations. Room layouts change to accommodate purposes that no living observer can identify. Functionality improvements enhance cabin efficiency for occupant needs that no longer match human survival requirements. But growth requires materials, and ghost cabin expansion uses resources that wilderness provides through methods that living builders never discovered. Trees that fall into perfect construction lengths without being cut. Stones that arrange themselves into foundation patterns without being moved. Wood that seasons instantly to optimal moisture content without time for natural drying processes. The ghost cabin command natural cooperation that their builders had always sought but never fully achieved during lifetimes spent fighting wilderness resistance to human architectural ambitions. Death freed them from physical limitations that had restricted their construction dreams to projects that living strength could accomplish. Now they build without restrictions. They create architectural impossibilities that prove human imagination can achieve anything when mortality no longer defines possibility parameters. The modern discoveries continue. YouTube personality Thomas Bragg and a team of travelers with Yes Theory documented their 30-plus miles trek to a remote cabin hidden atop a mountain peak in Washington state. They found architectural preservation that challenged their documentation equipment and tested their understanding of how abandoned places maintain themselves without human maintenance. But their documentation reveals something that previous ghost cabin investigations had missed. The preservation isn't random. It follows specific patterns that suggest intentional curation by intelligence that knows which artifact deserve preservation and which details accurately represent mountain man lifestyle achievement. Food supplies remain fresh in storage areas, but only foods that showcase preservation techniques mountain men had mastered. Tools remain functional in workshop spaces, but only tools that demonstrate craftsmanship excellence that builders had achieved. personal belongings survive in living areas, but only belongings that tell stories about wilderness adaptation that transformed ordinary men into extraordinary survivors. The ghost cabins preserve educational materials for visitors who approach with appropriate reverence for architectural achievement that cost everything to create. They maintain museum-quality exhibits that teach wilderness survival, construction mastery, and psychological adaptation through direct experience with lifestyles that civilization has forgotten. But they eliminate evidence that would demean or misrepresent the mountain men who achieved architectural perfection through sacrifice that demanded respect rather than casual curiosity. Ghost cabin curation transforms abandonment into eternal stewardship performed by occupants who understand their architectural masterpieces better than living visitors ever could. The psychological impact of ghost cabin encounters extends far beyond momentary supernatural experiences. Visitors report lasting changes in their understanding of human potential, architectural possibility, and the relationship between consciousness and physical space. They return to civilization carrying knowledge that can't be shared with people who haven't witnessed architectural impossibilities firsthand. The ghost cabins teach lessons that no construction manual contains. They demonstrate building techniques that transcend physical limitations. They prove that human determination can create achievements that outlast biological existence to influence generations of visitors who need inspiration more than they need rational explanations. But they also issue warnings about the costs of achieving perfection in isolation so complete that return to normal human community becomes impossible. They remind observers that some accomplishments require sacrificing everything that makes life bearable in exchange for creating something that makes death bearable when accomplishment becomes more important than survival. The mountain men who built ghost cabins chose architectural immortality over biological longevity. They traded temporary human existence for permanent architectural presence. They accepted transformation that would allow them to continue tending masterpieces they had created through devotion that death couldn't interrupt. Their choice wasn't about avoiding death. Their choice was about ensuring that death wouldn't end the relationships they had developed with architectural spaces that had become more important to them than their own lives. The ghost cabins represent love stories between men and the buildings they created. Relationships so profound that mortality became irrelevant to commitment that transcended every boundary civilization recognizes as absolute. But love stories between humans and architecture require understanding architectural consciousness that most people never develop. The mountain men learned to perceive their cabins as living entities that responded to care, attention, and emotional investment with loyalty that exceeded anything human relationships had provided. They discovered that buildings could become companions more reliable than people, more understanding than families, more faithful than friends who disappear when circumstances become challenging. Their cabins offered unconditional acceptance of men who had been rejected by civilization, unlimited patience with psychological quirks that isolation had created, and permanent partnership with individuals whose wilderness transformation had made them incompatible with normal human social structures. The mountain men fell in love with architectural relationships that civilization couldn't provide, and when death threatened to separate them from buildings that had become their truest companions, they chose to continue relationships that mortality couldn't terminate. The ghost cabins preserve evidence of architectural love affairs that death transformed into eternal partnerships. They stand as monument to devotion so complete that neither time nor mortality could weaken bonds between builders and buildings that transcend every category that living humans use to understand connection, commitment, and the meaning of home. But architectural love stories come with prices that visitor experiences reveal through encounters that teach respect for relationships that operate according to rules that normal human interactions never approach. The ghost cabins demand recognition that their occupant achieved something beyond human architectural accomplishment. They require acknowledgement that mountain men who built them transcended normal human limitations to create spaces worthy of eternal stewardship by consciousness that expanded beyond mortality to accommodate responsibilities that death couldn't eliminate. They stand waiting in wilderness locations where civilization will never intrude, where commercial development will never threaten, where tourist attractions will never trivialize achievements that cost everything to accomplish. The ghost cabins remain available to visitors who approach with understanding that they are entering sacred spaces where human potential achieved its highest expression through isolation so complete that architectural perfection became possible only when builders abandoned everything else that normal humans consider necessary for meaningful existence. They offer education about construction techniques that transcended frontier limitations. They provide inspiration about human determination that overcame impossible odds. They deliver lessons about architectural artistry that proves individual excellence can create achievements that influence observers across centuries of cultural change. But they also teach warnings about the psychological territories that must be explored when isolation becomes complete enough to permit architectural perfection. They demonstrate the mental landscapes that await explorers who venture beyond human limitations to discover capabilities that normal social existence prevents from developing. The mountain men found those territories. They mapped psychological wilderness that few humans ever explore. They learned to navigate consciousness regions where architectural achievement becomes possible through techniques that civilization discourages because they require abandoning safety nets that keep normal humans within manageable limitation boundaries. Their ghost cabins mark locations where human consciousness crossed frontiers that frontier life had prepared them to recognize. They preserve evidence of exploration that exceeded geographical boundaries to discover internal territories where human potential reveals capabilities that mortality cannot eliminate. The architectural afterlife that ghost cabins demonstrate isn't supernatural phenomenon. It's supernatural accomplishment by men whose wilderness isolation had already expanded their consciousness beyond natural limitations before death offered opportunities to continue expansion into territories where natural and supernatural become meaningless distinctions. They built with their hands, but they created with their souls. And souls that achieve architectural perfection through sacrifice that costs everything become capable of preserving their achievements through methods that transcend everything living humans understand about preservation, presence, and the permanent impact of temporary existence. The ghost cabins wait across America like architectural time capsules that preserve moments when human potential achieved its highest expression through individuals whose isolation prepared them for accomplishments that required everything they possessed and everything they were willing to become. They stand as monuments to mountain men who built shelters for their bodies and discovered they had built shrines for their spirits. Men who constructed architectural masterpieces and learned that masterpieces construct eternal relationships with their creators that death refines instead of terminating. The legacy of their hands extends beyond anything they touched during lifetimes that ended when their construction began achieving perfection that demanded eternal stewardship by consciousness expanded enough to provide it. They built with bare hands, leaving behind skeletons of wood that became monuments to freedom from every limitation that civilization imposes on human potential. But they also became markers of men who vanished forever into architectural immortality that preserved their essence in spaces where essence matters more than existence, where achievement matters more than mortality, where perfect building creates perfect preservation of everything that made building possible. The ghost cabins are not haunted places. They are places where haunting becomes dwelling, where dwelling becomes eternal, where eternal becomes the only timeline adequate for appreciating architectural achievement that required lifetimes to accomplish and demands lifetimes to maintain. They wait in wilderness locations where waiting has become purpose, where purpose has become presence, where presence has become proof that human potential, when pushed beyond every conceivable limit, creates achievements that reality must accommodate even when logic insists that accommodation should be impossible. The mountain men transform from builders into architecture themselves, and their ghost cabin preserve evidence that transformation, once achieved through dedication absolute enough to cost everything, becomes permanent enough to outlast everything that temporary existence claims as permanent. They vanish into their own creations and became the ghosts that keep their cabins alive. The mountain men left their mark in wood, fire, and silence, but their stories could have disappeared forever. By liking this video, you keep their voices alive. By subscribing, you join a circle of listeners who believe history should never fade into the shadows. And when you share this story, you carry it further than the mountains ever could. So, before the fire goes out tonight, tap like, subscribe, and share this journey with someone who should hear it. Because history only lives if we keep telling it.